afternoon, evening, ladies and gentlemen. George Moss again here at allpointstv.com, and accompanied with the great studio over there on University Drive, and that's the studio that is headed by the visionary, Flint visionary, Mr. Paul Herring, and we're always glad to have them with us at WFOV 92.1. We are allpointstv.com, and my program is called What's Going On, and we tape from 2 o'clock to 3 o'clock on Mondays, and the program airs again at 12 o'clock on WFOV, and I want to thank them for partnering with us here at allpointstv.com. I have to give a thank you to Paul Herring. I do think Paul Herring is one of the visionaries in the city of Flint, and he does so many things here for the city. I hope that we will give him his accolades. While we tend to we have these funerals, and we don't even talk about the person that are deceased. Aretha Franklin being the latest example of that, John. I mean, we have these funerals, and people have made some tremendous contributions, and we get there and we start talking about politics, or we talk about something that has nothing to do with the person's character and what they contributed while they were here. And so I hope we will give in these cases where people are really making a contribution, we will thank them for the things they're doing while they're here, because they're not going to be able to hear a lot of now that it's even talked about, but you can't hear anything that's being said at the funerals, and we don't even talk about the persons many times at the funerals. We go off on these tangents, and people can't figure out who's in the casket. And that was true of Aretha Franklin. And we just do too much of this politicking at these funerals these days. But I want to thank Paul Herring and give him his commendations, because he really deserves it. And there are so many things he does in the community, and he's not doing it because of he wants the applause. He's doing it because he's committed to uplifting the community, and we should be very thankful we have visionaries like that now in the city of Flint. Anyway, we are back again for another edition of the program here at allpointstv.com, and we are going to be here for the next hour. I hope you stay tuned for the next hour, and we will try to bring some things that would be in addition to what you're getting from the other networks. I brought 5 books to the studio today because I wanted to document what I'm going to be talking about in the program, and that is that we have an outlaw gangster government in Washington, and that is not what has made this country great. And I want to quote from, maybe not quote, but to show the documentation for what I'll be saying today. These 5 books are Throw Them All Out, which is a book written by Peter Swayze. And he also has another book out called, let me get his other book. Did I bring his other book today or not? Throw Them All Out is one of his really one of the treasures that he's written. How politicians and their friends get rich off insider stock tips, land deals, and cronyism that would send the rest of us to prison. And he is also the author of the book called The Architects of Ruin, talking about the people in Washington. These people are the architects of ruin. Almost all the problems that we have in this country right now can be traced to those persons in the nation's capital. And we have these politicians, multimillionaires. I mean, some of these people are Nancy Pelosi, who is aspiring to be the Speaker of the House if the Democrats win the House in November. Nancy Pelosi is worth an estimated $100 million. And what Dianne Feinstein, the senator from California, is worth $35 million. And just go down the list. On a salary for the longest while of $174,000, and these persons have all this money in their bank account based upon being in the government. And how did they get it? Well, they got it by the things that Peter Schweizer is talking about.
Remember years ago when Carter proposed the windfall profit tax because of the oil and stuff like that, the price of oil during his administration? He got basically really, made sure the oil companies had to pay a huge amount of money because they were enjoying that wealth coming in. Why don't we do that to senators and congressmen? Because of their connections, we should put an 80% tax on them. Because of the connections they're allowed to make in the role that they're in, they should be charged an 80% tax for that role. And so that way we can get money back, because these SOBs are actually using their connections that they're making in during our behalf, what they're supposed to be doing for themselves. So why don't we fine them like they did for the oil companies back during the Carter era?
Yeah, John, we should do all of those things, and also what they said last night on the program. The one that's it precedes Mark Levine's program, the revolution will be televised. That comes on at 9. I watch those two programs on Sunday night. Mark Levine's program comes on at 10 o'clock, and then the one before it, the revolution will be televised. And what they were saying on that program last night is that we're not going to be able to get anything done as far as the things done on our behalf until we cut the size of government. And that's the key right there, that the government, he made the point, the government is probably, we only need to have 1/10 the size of government. That means that 90% of what we have in Washington right now, the government that is in fact created behind the government, 90% of that bureaucracy needs to be cut out. And if we don't do that, we can't really reform anything in Washington. I think that Peter Schweizer's title is very appropriate. Throw them all out. I mean, we need to start cleaning House and cleaning the Senate. And this book, Throw Them All Out, the subtitle being How Politicians and Their Friends Get Rich Off Inside Stock Tips, Land Deals, and Cronyism. And they love to call that the cronyism, we like to call it, they love to call it crony capitalism. There's nothing capitalist about cronyism. Cronyism is collectivism, is not capitalism. And cronyism, that would send the rest of us to prison. And if anybody's waiting for them to throw themselves in jail, you'll be waiting a long time. That's just one of the books I brought. I like Napolitano's writings, and I brought two books by Napolitano. One of the books is called, let me deal with this one first. The Constitution in Exile: How the Federal Government has seized power by rewriting the supreme law of the land. That means rewriting the Constitution. And it's not so much they've rewritten it, it's just that they have gotten involved in avoidance, where they just avoid the document that is supposed to be the governing document that governs how we govern the country. And he writes a book called The Constitution in Exile, and that's exactly where the Constitution is right now. It's on the sideline and doesn't even apply anymore. And so they are just running the government. It's what Al.C. Hastings said, who is a senator from Florida, not the senator, the representative from Florida, who, by the way, when he was on the federal judiciary, this person was impeached and also convicted, which means he was therefore removed from his judgeship, because the Constitution requires for removal of federal office holders, it requires the federal office holder to be impeached, which is an official accusation of wrongdoing while in office. And then after the impeachment, which is the accusation in the House of Representatives, under Article 1, Section 2, Clause 5, where it says the House should have the sole power of impeachment. After the impeachment takes place, that is, say after the accusation has taken place, then it's referred to the Senate for trial in Article 1, Section 3, Clause 6. The trial should take place in the Senate. And if you get a 2/3 vote, then the person is in fact removed from the federal office, and Alcee Hastings was removed from the federal office. He was a judge in Florida, and they both impeached and convicted him. And then after he was impeached and removed from office, he decides to go and join the person that impeached him. And now he's sitting in the he's sitting in the House of Representatives.
I think sounds like Florida took a page out of Flint's playbook and we got a mayor bounced out of office because he was inept, and they elected him as a state rep, and his name shall remain nameless during the show. But I think anybody who's in the Flint area is well aware who I'm referring to. I just think it's insane. We keep on recycling politicians. I'm thinking, but they keep on doing it. They don't seem to, they ignore the objections.
We're waiting for the government to correct itself with the same people being in power that create the problem, and somewhere they're going to catch the bug, the reform bug, and they're going to therefore reform that which they put in place. If we believe that's going to happen, we not only are we naive, we're being suckered by these politicians, because reform is not in the mix. Here's another book by Napolitano. I could have brought other of his books as well. I like everything he's put out there, but I thought this book would be very important to the conversation as well today, and that is the book called "It is Dangerous to Be Right When the Government is Wrong: The Case for Personal Freedom." And this book is also written by the great Judge Napolitano, who is only bested, I think, as far as the national, the ones on TV. The only person I know that is besting Napolitano, I don't think that Alan Dershowitz does it, but I do think that Mark Levine is much more constitutionally grounded than Napolitano, but Napolitano is very good. It is dangerous to be right when the government is wrong, and it is dangerous to be right when the government is wrong, because the government has the ultimate power to determine who will stay out of jail and who will be put in jail. And a lot of these pleas you're seeing right now is because the government, once it starts to prosecute, really to persecute, the government will persecute you until you run out of money and you cannot defend yourself, and then you're broke at the end of the journey. So it is dangerous to be right when the government is wrong, and a lot of people are paying a penalty for trying to stand up to this corruption that we have in Washington. But these are gangsters running the government in Washington. One of the books by De Lorenzo, and I brought two books by him. The book called Official Lies, How Washington Misleads Us, or How Washington Lies to Us. And that's part of the gangster government that we have. And the other book I brought by De Lorenzo is called Organized Crime. I brought this book to the studio a number of times before, because I just don't think we can get away from the fact, and we see it over and over again, when government is like, for example, the hearings last week, where the Senate Judiciary Committee was interviewing Brett Kavanaugh, and here we have these gangsters on the Senate committee trying to see if Brett Kavanaugh, who's one of the most qualified persons to ever vie for the Supreme Court judgeship, trying to see if he's fit to sit on the Supreme Court. And here these gangsters are the ones trying to make the decision. De Lorenzo's book called Organized Crime, and it is subtitled The Unvarnished Truth About Government. And this book right here documents, I think, again, as if we don't have enough documentation out there already, as they document themselves every day and what they're carrying out in Washington. We just have gangsters run the federal government. Organized Crime, The Unvarnished Truth About Government. And all five of these books, and I could have brought from my own library, I could have brought 50 other books that would further document what's happening in Washington, and it is not going to be reformed by a single person or by a single election. And America has got to understand what time it is, and what their due diligence is in terms of the upcoming election. If you want to continue down this path that's been carved out by the present outsiders president, whom they want out of there like yesterday, because they understand that this outsider doesn't have the baggage, because this is the first elective offices that he's held. He doesn't have the baggage that they have. And because he's never had political office before, he is not part of the corruption through which you go up the scale and you arrive in some of the higher offices, such as the House of Representatives or the Senate. And then the presidency, you haven't paid the dues to all of the paymasters along the way to get to the presidency. He hasn't paid that bill. And he doesn't have the same baggage that they have in these elective offices in Washington. And that's why both parties are in fact ganging up on him, and they want him out of there. And they continue to run this narrative that this person is running a chaotic administration, that that the president is in fact doing untold crimes, and without them naming the crimes, in Washington, D.C. And his book by Bob Woodward called Fear, and we're supposed to be afraid of the administration that we put in office because he's in there doing what? I like to have that documented by Bob Woodward. And I find it very interesting that Bob Woodward is back on the national scene, by the way, because Bob Woodward, and I said this before he came out of the woodwork again. I said this after reading Haldeman's book, H.R. Haldeman's book, called The Ends of Power, which I read that book in 1978, and it informed me about what really had happened in terms of bringing the Richard Nixon administration down. I mean, I thought that Watergate was the most terrible thing that ever happened in Washington, until I began to recognize what these five authors here are saying. Organized crime, official lies, Washington tells us. It's dangerous to be right when the government is wrong. The Constitution in exile, and then throw them all out. Before I read any of those books, I read Haldeman's book, who was one of the president's men that was written about in Bob Woodward's book, and Carl Bernstein, who co-authored the book called The President's Men. When I read Haldeman's book called The Ends of Power, it kind of floored me, because I'm reading this in 77, 78, in that time period. And I'm still starry-eyed about government. I believe everything that I've been taught in my college days, undergraduate school. I believed in the education that I was. I didn't recognize it as being propaganda pretty much at that time. But when I read that book, it began to raise some questions in my mind, and I had to start paying attention to what that book pointed out, and that was that the Fourth Estate brought Richard Nixon down. Well, I was, I had some very good government, teachers, and when I read Haldeman's book, I did recognize that the president was not removed by that which is contained in the Constitution. And I couldn't figure out at that time, until I read Haldeman's book, how did we get a president out of office, and the president had not gone through the process spelled out in the Constitution in Article 2, Section 4, which spells out how we remove a president if the president gets out of character and goes out of control, violates the law. No person is above the law. So then how do we then bring the person under the duress of the Constitution mandates? How do we do that? And the framers had a provision in the Constitution to bring that result about. If the president goes out of control, we have a remedy for it. And I didn't see that remedy being used. And when I read Haldeman's book, that was like an aha moment for me, because the president, if he's going to be removed from office, he should have been removed from office by those that we elect to be the standard bearers over the process of the president's removal, and that was not applied. And Haldeman, who wrote the book called The Ends of Power, was talking about how the president was removed from power by the Fourth Estate. That was my first time hearing about the Fourth Estate. Now we call it. Now we're talking about the deep state, of which the fourth estate, by the way, which means the media, which Haldeman was talking about the fourth estate being the media. The media is a part of the deep state, but it's a very powerful entity because it controls public opinion. It guides public opinion. And what they did with Watergate was that they just kept it in front of the public for 2 years. I mean, the break-in occurred in '72, and they kept it before the public for 2 years, and they hounded Richard Nixon out of office. And the ones that were in the forefront of that was the same Bob Woodward, who just put the book out called Fear. Bob Woodward and Carl Bernstein put a book out called All the President's Men, and they were being fed information at that time by a person that resembles what is happening right now with this this memo that was this editorial that was written anonymously in the New York Times last week. And look at how much piling on that went on last week. We had the article came out in the New York Times and the editorial page. We then had Bob Woodward's book come out, and we had this fiasco going on with the hearings of Donald Trump's nominee, thoroughly qualified by all of the indicators, and just all of these things happening one after another, keeping it before the public as if the problem is Donald Trump. And they definitely are trying to tumble this man's administration, and they have not accepted yet the fact that this man was duly elected by the American people. And this Russian narrative, which has been proven false because we brought no evidence of any collusion that went on between the Donald Trump administration and the Russians. And we've been investigating this matter. Mueller has been investigating this matter now for 14 months. And we have found there's been nothing reported about collusion. And yet this investigation goes on. And why does it go on? It goes on because the same people that was in back of the toppling of the Nixon administration is determined to topple the Donald Trump administration, because he's an outsider in this case, and the persons that are in back of the government, the ones that you don't see, the ones that are manipulating the environment, they're trying to in fact topple a duly held election. And if you're going to take the president out, then you take him out through the process put in place by the framers. But that's not what we see going on here. They're trying to do this through a backdoor approach by these non-elected officials. We didn't elect Mueller to do anything in government. Mueller was appointed. And I'll tell you one other thing that we have to look at. We have to look at Jeff Sessions. I don't think about it as pointed out Jeff Sessions' role. And I think that we have to look and see if Jeff Sessions was part of the deep state. Because Sessions came out, if you remember, he came out very early to support Donald Trump. When Donald Trump went to Alabama and was campaigning there, Jeff Sessions put on the Make America Great Again hat, and was one of the early ones in the government, in the Congress, to come out in support of Donald Trump. And that was then Donald Trump, of course, is beholden to Jeff Sessions to appoint him somewhere in the administration. And the logical place to put him in the administration would be in the Attorney General's role. But look what Jeff Sessions did when he was appointed. He never said that if he was confirmed, he would in fact get in the Attorney General's office and then recuse himself. And if he doesn't do that, then this investigation would not have gone on in terms of putting a deep state actor, which we now know he's a deep state actor, and that's Rosenstein. Rosenstein is the Assistant Attorney General, and when Jeff Sessions recused himself, then you have Rosenstein in charge. How did that happen? And has anybody looked at Jeff Sessions, who may well have been one of the... Okay, you got to take a break. We'll see you on the other side of the break, those of you who are listening at WFOV, and we will see you in 4 minutes on the other side of the break. We're going to continue what we're doing here with those at allpointstv.com, and we're just going to continue what we're talking about, and we'll fill them in. If we are too far away from where we are when they took the break, we will fill them in when they come back. But I think we have to look at Jeff Sessions, because I think Jeff Sessions is very strange that Peter Strzok and Lisa Page were saying that they had another. They were saying they had another ace in the hole if, in fact, Donald Trump became president, and they were doing everything they could to keep him from becoming president. They said that in the event that he did become president, they were actually saying that they had something else in place in case the voters went to the polls and did what they thought would not go on, but then they were not taking any chances, that they had another plan in place to, in fact, carry out another aspect of this of Donald Trump not being president. And I think that is the Mueller probe. But Mueller doesn't become appointed if Jeff Sessions is not recused from doing the job as Attorney General. If he does not do that, we don't have a person that is probing into the Russian collusion, because Jeff Sessions could not have done that, because he is the appointee of the president. But Jeff Sessions gave, by recusing himself, he then put a deep state actor, Rosenstein, in the position of the Attorney General's office, and now he is in fact the one that appointed Mueller. That would not have happened if Jeff Sessions had recused himself, and they could not have been so relying upon something else going on beyond the election if that does not take place. So I think we need to look at Jeff Sessions, particularly what Jeff Sessions has done in his officiating over the Attorney General's office. He's been absent, AWOL. He's not done anything to try to rein any of these things in to keep the president from doing his job, and just raise a question about why is that going on. And is Jeff Sessions if he's not a deep state actor, then how do you explain his hands off in everything having to do with this investigation of the president, who's guilty of one thing? He won the election in 2016, and that wasn't supposed to happen. And so these deep state actors, these organized criminals, the ones who are, running the government and over the Constitution in exile, the ones that Peter Schweizer says we need to throw them all out, which he's not saying Democrats or Republicans. He's saying we need to clean house. We have gangsters up there in Washington, and the only thing the American people have going for them right now, the only thing we have going for them right now in Washington is President Trump. And that's only because Trump comes from the outside, and he's not a part of this deep state apparatus that's in place. I don't know if you heard, I don't know if anybody paid a lot of attention last Tuesday to the opening comments by Ben Sasse. Okay, we are now welcoming back those at WFOV, and we're glad to have you back. Thank you for coming back, and hope you will stay tuned for the next 30 minutes or so as we wrap this up. But I was mentioning Ben Sasse. Ben Sasse was made some opening comments last Tuesday on the Senate Judiciary Committee, and what he said. Not that I'm endorsing Ben Sasse. I think Ben Sasse is part of the problem also, but Ben Sasse made some very important comments on the Senate floor, on the Senate Judiciary Committee. He said that we pretend, he said, we go back home and we pretend that we are here in the Congress legislating. He said, we do not legislate in the Congress. What we do is pass these bills, and then we pass off the legislating to those entities that are created by the bills, and they in fact do the legislating as we pass off the particulars and how the bill is being carried out. In other words, they pass a bill, and then the bill requires implementation, and then the implementation goes on in the executive branch, and then those branches end up doing the enforcement. And so the legislative branch does not have to pay any political consequences for the acts that they are passing because they're not involved in the enforcement of it. They pass it off to these others. And he said, and it creates a vacuum in the federal government, and that vacuum is filled by all of these people, none of whom are elected by the American people, and that's by design. I thought that was really, of all the things that went on last week, all the theatrics that went on last week, that was the most riveting statement that was made. And all the things that went on, Ben Sasse made the comment that the legislative branch does not legislate. They pass these things off to they're political people behind the scenes, but they're non-political in the sense that they are not elected by the American people. So they are bureaucrats. They are political bureaucrats. They are political bureaucrats. They're bureaucrats playing a political role without having the answer to the American people. And that's what the danger is that we have the politicians behind the politicians that don't go before the voters for the endorsement of what they're doing. And that's one thing I was noticing last night also in the program called The Revolution the Revolution Will Be Televised, and that is that he recommended that we itemize what each person in the government does. What are their roles? And you tell the American people what role they're playing. And maybe that would bring about some accountability. Who are these people and what roles are they playing? Maybe we could do it that way. But we have to definitely cut the size of the government down. And he said to cut it down by 90%. We only need about 10% of what we have in government right now. And that's about the size of it. The government is too large. And you cannot regulate a government that is larger than than Walmart, which is the largest business company in the United States. It's too large. You just can't manage it. It's too many different corridors of power that the federal government has. And so one of the remedies, quite frankly, and we do have the power to remedy our government. We can take our vote in November and exercise our vote. Every member of the House of Representatives, every 2 years, come before the voters. Every 2 years, 1/3 of the Senate come before the voters. And we could turn the Senate out 1/3 every 2 years, and in 6 years, every senator can be renewed. We can renew the entire Senate in every 6-year term, because the senators are up for re-election, 1/3 of them every 2 years, and within 6 years, the entire Senate is up for re-election. And we got to stop sending these people repeatedly to Washington to do the bidding of the lobbyists and doing their own business. And that's why this book by Schweitzer is an important book. Throw them all out.
I've referenced several times during the course of the conversation about corruption in D.C. about everybody would gain a lot of information, a lot of insight if they watched a movie that came out in the late 80s, early 90s called The Last Emperor. And when the eunuchs, but basically it was at the threshold where, China was fading as an imperial power. Just before there was an internal disruption going on by foreign agents and stuff like that. And there's attempts to reform the corruption that was going on, and where the emperor still held the reins before the communists took over. And anyway, when he tried to institute some of these reforms, the eunuchs, which usually have huge political sway, they used to hold offices. They were pushed out of the royal court, but all of a sudden the records building was caught on set on fire during the night, because they didn't want that opened up and examined, because they realized the corruption was so depth. Thing is, the only good thing about China and the eunuchs is they weren't, because they're eunuchs, they were unable to reproduce. The hierarchical structure, the bureaucratic structure, the bureaucrats and the politicians entrenched in those offices that don't have to be examined do reproduce, and those kids, and they've been in there for generations, and that's a problem. It's so entrenched, it's so mired down with that.
John, we do not see how entrenched this corruption is. It is very entrenched, and it's so deeply embedded in every aspect of government. You're tempted to call for, let's just simply start all over again, but there is a remedy to it in terms of the American people. We can in fact get back to constitutional government in this country. The Constitution right now is in exile. As Napolitano says, the Constitution is in exile, but the ones that exile, that are the ones in Washington, do not intend to have the government put into check by the supreme law of the land. And that's what I should have said that earlier. That's what Alcee Hastings, the one that was impeached, that now is in the House of Representatives. Alcee Hastings said a couple of years ago, he said the law is what we say it is, and that's about what it is. The law is what they say it is. It has nothing to do with the Constitution of the United States. And Napolitano is correct in saying the Constitution in exile. He's also correct in saying that it's dangerous to be right when the government is wrong. And we're seeing that by the people that are being put in jail. Dinesh D'Souza, example of that. Dinesh D'Souza became a critic of the government. And the next thing we know, he did there was a misdemeanor that he created. And he's assigned to jail. This man was put in jail because they're a critic of the Obama administration. And you either admit to your guilt or what they charge you with, or they bankrupt you. And look what's happening to Manafort right now. That's what happens. It's dangerous to be right when the government is wrong. And let me say one thing about the America, the exceptionalism of this country. America is an exceptional country. There is American exceptionalism, but it has nothing to do with the American government. That's not what exceptionalism is. The exceptionalism is in the American people, and the fact that we were able to get off the ground before the government broke from underneath the restraints placed on it by the Constitution, and in the time period of the framers setting the government up and the government going out of control. In between those two periods of time, the entrepreneurs were able to have enough liberty to build the institution of this country, the business institutions and other institutions of this country, to which we were able to create wealth unparalleled in history. And that's one thing I like about Donald Trump. Donald Trump is coming in, and what he's doing, and look what happened when this happened. What Donald Trump did was that he came in and got government and pushed government off of the business community, first of all, by deregulating, putting a lot of regulations on the sidelines and deregulating a lot of the, putting a lot of the federal mandates, putting them on the sideline, and then putting more money in the hands of the American people so they can spend more of their money. And guess what happens as a result of that? The economy took off. Because the problem in terms of the economy being stifled is government over-regulating the businesses. And why do they do that? They do it because the politicians want to be the ones of influence, and the ones who are the natural influences in a society are the producers. And if they're going to be influencing, then the politicians are therefore more on the sidelines, and they have the power to invoke and inject themselves, invoke, first of all, laws that restrain the producers, and then they also have the power to inject themselves into arenas where they don't belong. The Constitution restrains the politicians. There is an itemization in the Constitution that says that Congress shall, and it lists in Article 1, Section 8, it lists all of the powers of the federal government. And those powers that's not given to the federal government, those powers are restrained to the states. Anybody believe that the states now have any authority inside the federal structure? All powers not delegated to the federal government, according to Article 1, Section 8, any powers that's not enumerated or delegated to the federal government, those powers are retained by the states and to the people therein. That means then that Amendment 10 is invoked to all the powers that's not given to the federal government. All those powers, therefore, in Amendment 10 is restrained and kept by the states because the states did not delegate the powers to the federal government. In other words, the states delegated the powers to the federal government. It creates the federal government, and then it delegates the powers the federal government would have because they wanted the federal government to be under restraints based upon the limitation of the federal power, with the greatest amount of power held by the states and by the people in those states, so that power is not concentrated on the federal level. And they just kept working it and working it and working it until the Constitution is now in exile. And Napolitano is correct in saying the Constitution exile from left, from right, and from center. In other words, it doesn't matter which party gets into power. The fact is that it doesn't matter which of the parties in power. He says here in the on the back cover, does anyone understand the vision of America's founding fathers, the limited government concept? The courts and Congress apparently don't have a clue. And he says that the American people have to be aware that what has happened to the federal system in America, they have to be aware that the government is out of control because the Constitution in America today is in exile. It's been exiled by the politicians. The political classes are exiled the Constitution. And we're not going to be able to rein the government in until we get back to what was intended by the framers. And the framers intended the federal government to be a government of the people, by the people, for the people. And that means the government has to be beholden to the custodians of the Constitution, the people, who are supposed to be the ones that are rendering to the government custodialship for a period of time, voted by the people, who go there to do the bidding of the people based upon the mandates in the Constitution. They're not doing that. And the people have got to take control of that by what they do in the voting process. That's our power. Going to the polls every 2 years and voting for who is going to be the office holders. And I think that De Lorenzo is making a point here. Throw them all out. I mean, Schweitzer making a point here. Throw them all out. Throw them all out. Not just the Democrats or the Republicans. Throw them all out. And throw them out on a regular basis so that we can regain control of the government where they know that we mean business. They don't think we mean business. The government is out of control because we are not taking the responsibility that we have to use the ballot box to render good government, to demand good government by anyone that's in Washington, in power, and doing things they should not be doing. The voters have the responsibility, the constitutional responsibility, to hold them to being responsible office holders. And if we don't do that, we get what is being talked about here in De Lorenzo's other book called Organized Crime. The reason why we organize crime is because the office holders do not fear the voters. Jefferson said that when the government fears the people, we have liberty. And when the people fear their government, we have tyranny. And the question is, do we have liberty in this country, or do we have tyranny in this country? When the people fear their government, they have tyranny. When the government fears the people, we have liberty. And I don't think about it would say that we have in the United States right now that our government fears the people, because we don't have government of the people anymore. We don't have government of the people, by the people, for the people. We have government of the politicians, for the politicians, for the political elite. What's that movie out by Napolitano talks about that? There's a movie out no, it's put out by Dinesh D'Souza. The movie is called it's taken off of the movie called The Birth of a Nation. It's called The Death of a Nation. And America is being destroyed by its political class because we don't have government under the restraints of the Constitution. We have a government out of control because the government does not any longer listen to the American people, because the American people are not doing their constitutional duty to hold the government under the restraints of the Constitution by turning them out if they don't do what they're supposed to do. That's our responsibility, to go to the polls every 2 years and render them out of office if they don't do the people's bidding, and they're not doing that in Washington, D.C. right now. We don't have government of the people, by the people, for the people. And because we don't have that, we have the Constitution in exile. They could not do that if the people were in fact overlooking the operation of government and demanding that the government do the bidding of the American people. It's not doing that because we don't demand the government does it. And that's our responsibility, to demand that the government that we have elected officials doing the business of the electorate. Until we do that, we're not going to have them rectifying anything in Washington. And we really have a president, quite frankly, that is in Washington right now as an outsider. We need outsiders. The insiders are not going to correct this problem. We need outsiders. We need some outsiders going to Washington in November. But we have an outsider at the top of the government in President Donald Trump. And I don't care what Obama says, what he said last week. This is not Obama's economy, and this is not Obama's government. Donald Trump came in because the people wanted something different in Washington. And they went to the poll and voted for a person that's doing, quite frankly, a very good job. Donald Trump is doing an excellent job. And I understand what they're trying to do. They want this power back in the hands of the politicians. And if we give that power back to them in November, if we vote for a Democratic majority in November in the House, the first thing that's going to happen in Washington is we're going to have an impeachment of this president. I don't think we'll have enough votes to bring about the removal of the president, but you can certainly frustrate the president by tying up his hands in impeachment, having to defend himself, and then you're simply doing what? You are canceling out the election by the president not being able to do his job because he's so busy doing these other things that have nothing to do with what we elected him to do. And they definitely intend to bring about the president's impeachment because they don't like what this president is doing. And Obama came out last week talking about, don't forget that this economy started with his administration. We have 1.9% growth. And we're headed in the wrong direction under Obama. We had 4.2% growth in the last quarter, and some are saying that the growth would be even higher than that because businesses are still beginning to create jobs. They created 217,000 jobs in this last quarter. 217,000 jobs are created. And so the economic engine is expanding in America. And the revenues, by the way, in the federal government is expanding also because there are more taxpayers that are working, and so more workers, more taxes. So the tax base is increasing. Lowering taxes has increased the taxes in the cost because more persons are working, because more people are spending money, and therefore businesses can expand the operation and employ more people. So the economy is expanding. That's not because of anything Obama did. Obama was in fact frustrating the expansion because you're regulating the economy and therefore constricting the expansion. You're putting more people in dependency in government. Now we have the economy expanding because you have more people. You have more people working, more people spending money. Therefore, businesses can, in fact, employ more people because they're making more profit, and the government, therefore, is being enriched with the tax cuts. Even though you're returning more money to the people, the tax base has increased in Washington because there are more people paying taxes. I'm just making a point here that we can understand our role, and we can turn this engine around. Because in 2 months, we can go to the poll and we can, in fact, continue what Donald Trump is doing by making sure that we have more and more people that are going to be on the Trump train and continuing to do what Donald Trump is doing, because Donald Trump is really the one that's brought this country back from the brink. This country was going in the wrong direction. And at least give the president credit for having turned this ship around. And a lot of people now are optimistic about the direction the country is going in. And you could not say that prior to 2016 when Donald Trump was elected, because this country was going in the wrong direction, both in the House, in the Senate, and in the president.
Don't you think it's weird now that Obama just recently, is basically trying to take claim for the economy? Now, I'll be honest. We all know the presidents both inherit bad situations as well as possibly good situations from their predecessor. Okay, but here's the thing: the Democrats are always going to say, "Here's what Obama did." Well, guess what? When initial stages of his taking over from Bush, what did he do? What approach he used to the economy to get it back going back was the same that Bush already had. He retained the same people. Okay, Republican, Democrat basically retain the same handlers on that. So the situation is that now Trump's, come on, it is way beyond. Obama was saying that better growth rates are impossible now. The 1 or 2% is going to be the new norm. Now he's saying, look what you have to look when that recovery started happening. He's trying to take credit for something that happened well beyond his time of being in office. And now, and the Democrats are saying, yeah, he did. It's just like old BS. Okay, maybe some situation was foundational was already done under Obama's term, again, using the same handlers Bush had in place. But come on, give me a break. This is doing much better than he anticipated. He even stated he didn't expect anything like this when he was still president. Obama stated that. Now he's trying to take credit for what's happening under the Trump administration.
This is not Obama's economy, and you cannot say that it is when Donald Trump is doing the opposite of what Obama was doing. There were no tax cuts during Obama's administration, and these regulations were more essentially put on the books during that time period. And this man is taking these regulations off the book. So the very opposite policies are being put in place here. And to say that the economy is Obama's economy when he's reversing Obama's policies is nonsense. I also have to say that I've never seen a president before. I don't think we've had a president, certainly in our lifetime, that has stood down from power, no longer in presidential office, and would come out and take a shot at the president as Obama did last week. I've never seen that happened before. I give Bush credit. I don't think Bush agreed with everything that a lot of things that Obama did. But one thing that Bush did is that he kept his mouth closed about criticizing the president, because you have to respect the office holder. And Bush did not come out with any critique of Obama, nor did Bush Warren come out and critique Bill Clinton, because that's not what you do. The president has to respect the fact that his successor has been elected, and therefore now the ones who's doing the presidential job is the person's in office right now. And because you were once there, you respect the office holder, and you don't take the office down in front of the public because you once were there yourself. You have to respect the office. Okay, well, keep in mind we have power we can use, and in 2 months we can go to the polls and do a lot to right the course of this ship. Until next time, I want you to follow your dream. If you don't follow your dream, you'll never know what's on the other side of the rainbow.